Hi, this is Izzy, and since I couldn't be there, I decided to record my part of the presentation. So I'm going to be talking about PTSD in the brain and the biology behind trauma. And so to understand PTSD fully, we need to look inside the brain and kind of consider biological aspects as well as psychological aspects. So first, we would be talking about the memory creation system. And this kind of starts with our six senses and taking in the threat and assessing it. So if we were, for example, to see a threat such as a tiger or someone holding a gun to us, that's more of a relevant example. Our six senses, seeing, the smells, hearing, would kind of take this in, and it would be transmitted to the amygdala, which is right here. And so after that information is transmitted to the amygdala, it is then transmitted to the hippocampus. And in the hippocampus, the threat is kind of put into words so that our brain can describe it and kind of process it. So whereas before it might have just been a visual, now we can kind of describe the experience. So after the hippocampus, the threat is transmitted to the prefrontal cortex, which is right here, and that is where the experience is compared and contrasted to other experiences. So it kind of looks at our past and what we've gone through and tries to assess how bad the threat is or how not bad the threat is. And so after the threat is gone, the prefrontal cortex sends information to the amygdala, giving it like an all-clear signal, and then the threat and the experience of the threat is kind of filed in our brain as a past experience and trauma. So the next part of the PTSD in the brain is looking at the sympathetic nervous system. And so basically the threat, it also starts in the amygdala, and the information is transferred to our brainstem. And then the brainstem secretes a hormone called neuroadrenaline, and it's a substance pretty similar to dopamine. And so this reaches all of our vital organs, and then something happens where our body reacts to the threat. And so we start sweating, and our pulse increases, our heart rate increases, our pupils dilate, our digestive system and immune system start to shut down. And these are all responses to threats. They all have reasons behind them. For example, we sweat so that the enemy, shall we say, can't grab us, and our pupils dilate to take in more light so that we can see better. So some more key parts of how our brain takes in threats is the hormonal system and the serotonin system. So when the threat reaches the amygdala, again, it's all centering the amygdala, which is right here. The threat is transferred to the hypothalamus, which is right here. I think that's how it's pronounced, hypothalamus, whatever. And so basically, there are steps that come after this to make sure that the hormone cortisol is regulated, to make sure that our energy to deal with the stressful situation is controlled. Also, serotonin, it kind of controls our stress levels so that when the threat is over, we can kind of move on and restore our energy. So the idea of PTSD is actually quite simple in that in the brain, when someone has PTSD, it basically just means that something in the process that I just talked about has gone wrong, either anatomically or chemically, and this in turn causes mood disorders. So one of the things that has been proven anatomically is that the hippocampus of someone with PTSD is actually smaller than someone without PTSD. So the hippocampus kind of controls the ability to differentiate between memory and real life. So when the hippocampus shrinks, basically someone's ability to tell whether it's a memory or not kind of gets, they're not able to differentiate as well. And this in turn leads to one of the most common symptoms of PTSD, which is flashbacks. So you're experiencing the past as if you're living it in this current moment. So another thing that we can see anatomically when looking at PTSD in the brain is a hyperaroused amygdala. And so basically when these subjects who had PTSD were re-exposed to their trauma through either movies or other senses, whether it be smell or touch, scientists noticed that their amygdala was more active. So this just basically means that the whole system of responding to threats, as I said before, it all centers in the amygdala. This just means that our ability to respond to threat is kind of hyperactive, so that even when there aren't threats, we're kind of in the mentality of responding to threats. And next is kind of the more chemical aspect of how PTSD affects the brain. So basically, chemically, there are some things that change when one has PTSD. So one of the things that scientists notice is that people have really, really high neural adrenaline levels. And so this is a structure of what that chemical looks like. As I said before, it's chemically similar to dopamine. And when this chemical is there are really high levels of this in someone's body, it just makes them very hypervigilant. So they are ready to respond to a threat even when there is no threat. And another chemical aspect is that scientists discovered there's a low level of cortisol in people's body who have PTSD. So when the level of cortisol is low, people aren't able to respond appropriately to real threats, or even threats that aren't real and just model the real threat that they had in the past. So for example, if someone who is traumatized by a robbery were to see a robbery in a movie, they may start sweating profusely, vomiting, even when the response is totally inappropriate for the situation. So now I'll be talking about kind of the treatment of PTSD and what patients experiencing these symptoms can do to make themselves feel better. And so the types of therapy that are most common in treating PTSD patients are cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, cognitive processing therapy, known as CPT, and prolonged exposure therapy. And so in CBT and CPT, it's kind of the idea of processing the thought. And figure 15 over here kind of shows the main triangle model of the CBT program, and it's kind of self-explanatory. And so prolonged exposure therapy, as you can see in figure 16, is exposing the patient to models of their actual trauma. So this figure shows a soldier kind of playing a video game that simulates what he went through perhaps in combat, and so through being exposed, the theory is that one may be able to better process when the idea of the threat comes up again. And in terms of medications, the main medications used to treat PTSD are in the class of SSRIs, known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and they kind of regulate the levels of serotonin in one's body. And the most common ones are Celexa, Prozac, Paxil, and Zoloft, and these are their non-label names, but what you would see in a doctor's office or on advertisements are these names. And so that's basically it for the treatment of PTSD. There's no one correct way, but Usually it's a combination of therapy and medications to treat PTSD patients.